This is Global Order. I'm Hindol Sen Gupta. Dr. Gautam Sen has joined me from London. We're going to discuss something really interesting today. We're going to discuss Dhurandhar, the movie. The second part has just released. It's making waves in theaters around the world. But Dhurandhar is not just a movie. Part one and part two will break probably all records and become one of the biggest, or most watched Hindi movies ever, or one of the most watched Indian movies ever. But there is a bigger story to Dhurandhar, which Dr. Sen and I are going to discuss, which is Dhurandhar's role in building India's, in a sense, India's myth-making process. For a long time, parts of Hindi cinema and other cinema in India were not part of this. But something is changing. Something is changing in India as it tries to build a new kind of national mythology around its rise. To discuss all of that, Dr. Sen from London. Gautam Sen, welcome once again to Global Order.
Thank you, Hindul. Good to be with you.
Let me begin, Dr. Sen, to talking about how this is very, very interesting. You saw Dhurandhar 1. I also saw it. I saw bits and pieces of Dhurandhar 2 also. There is something very interesting going on in Dhurandhar, which ties directly to the construction of a new kind of story for India, isn't it?
This is about the issue of the narrative on India, which has been discussed a great deal in recent years. There's a lot of angst and a lot of debate about what this means and why it hasn't taken off. I should say straight away that is something quite ironic and amusing, that what has not succeeded since 1925 in building a narrative which we can trace back to Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay, indeed Rabindranath Tagore and others in the 19th century, what could not be done in 100 years or so has been turned around in 1 week, 2 weeks by a film. And it has given it a fillip, which is quite astonishing. And it is, in a way, filling a vacuum, which obviously was there all the while, but remained unsatisfied. As I said, India does have a narrative. It is not that India doesn't have a narrative, but uniquely among countries, its narrative is not a unifying one. It's a narrative of division. The overarching narrative construction of the self, as Terence Ranger and Eric Hobsbawm said in their book, Invention of Tradition, really never took off beyond Bankim, Tagore, and most of all, actually, oddly enough, but the transcendental role of Swami Vivekananda. But it never really took off beyond some, definitely a part of the elite, and somewhat in the masses too, but it really
Also Aurobindo.
And Aurobindo, of course. Aurobindo, yes, indeed, very much Maharishi Aurobindo, because he lived longer and was at it for a great many times with a lot of insight and intelligence. But the narratives we have, actually, if we step back, are what do we have? The national narrative is about the ancient caste divisions of India, the kind of thing which is now being described as racism in the United States in court cases, that caste and race are the same. That is our overriding national narrative, which is a narrative of total division, and we see that across India. And the other narratives we have are regional ones. The most poisonous of all is the Dravidian ideology, which totally privileges the Aryan invasion theory and rejects India. Now, of course, they are vitriolically questioning the ancient identity of Sanatana Dharma. Very openly, the Deputy Prime Minister, Udayanidhi Stalin. The other one we have is, of course, the relatively modern Khalistan ideology in the state of Punjab, which is again rejecting the entire past of the common thread and roots of Hinduism and Sikhism. If I may add, Maharaja Ranjit Singh was not a Sikh monarch. He was actually a Hindu monarch, but never mind about that. That will be too controversial for some nowadays. And now we have the bizarre phenomenon which has turned on its head of Marathi Manus in Maharashtra, which has now done a complete 180-degree turn. And then we have, in the province you and I come from, communism. All of these are a rejection of any kind of connected narrative on India. All of these emphatically reject. The best can be said about all these ideologies is that they have tried to substitute that with something called secularism. And secularism in practice has meant that we make ourselves from scratch sometime in the 40s and 50s without imagining a past. Our past actually is erased and we reimagine ourselves according to some high principles of communal harmony and amity, but without any anchorage to inspire and to connect us with our ancestors. Now, this has never happened anywhere in the world, and not successfully. And secularism, of course, was a variant of Christianity, as the European Commission Court has announced in the past that secularism is an aspect of Christianity, and it was actually basically a negotiated outcome between the overwhelming dominance of the church and the emerging secular Enlightenment order. It had absolutely nothing to do with the Indian predicament, whereby we do not actually have a deity, we do not have an almighty. Our critical worldview is not even truth. It is not knowledge or belief. It is not faith or belief. It is only knowledge and the application of human reason, which adapts as well. So we may have a discussion about Shruti and Smriti, but that's a separate matter. So we ended up with a very peculiar dog's breakfast, so to speak, where we do not know who we are, and therefore we do not know what our interests are. And what actually was happening in reality was an attempt to legitimize Islamic rule over 1,000 years. That was our history. The history of the Khiljis and the Mughals was our history. And our heroes, and I was taught this when I was in school at the age of 15, the golden history of India. Tipu Sultan and Hyder Ali were great heroes of the Indian anti-imperialist struggle. Now, of course, that has changed a great deal in recent years. And the most critical part of the Indian past, of which we can legitimately be proud, the so-called golden age of the Gupta period, was forgotten. And the book by William Dalrymple, which is being celebrated by the Sangh Parivar, excludes that one period from the wonder that was India. The one period which is truly a Hindu period of great aesthetic, literary and scientific achievement is not there in his book. So we have this peculiar situation in India where we do not have a narrative. And Dhurandhar, by accident perhaps, inadvertently perhaps, has opened a can of worms. Its popularity cannot be explained by any other reason because they didn't do much promotion, from what I understand. They didn't do much promotion. It really appealed to the gut sensibility of the mass of Indians. And there is now something filling this vacuum, which we must respond to. Unfortunately, so powerful has been the colonial imperial ideology of our self-perception, and the British have played a dismal role in this with Dravidianism and Khalistanism. All of this is of British origin, taken up by the Americans and others subsequently, that our educated elites, our political class, are also victims of this ideology. At some level, even they are part of this colonial imperial ideology of self-perception where, as my great historian friend from the United States says again and again, we do not know who we are and what our interests are. Now, what does tradition, narrative do? Maybe that is something we should try to understand. What does it do? Let's start with some examples. One critical dimension of how people define themselves is definitely with their past, without any doubt. The past is what creates sensibility about the present and pride in the past. It is never all myth. It is truth and myth admixed together. Often the truth becomes myth. And let me say something as an aside. In generations to come, we will look back to at least two people that I can think of who are current, who will be part of this mythology of India. The one is certainly the Prime Minister Narendra Modi as a maker of modern India, the true maker of modern India, and his National Security Advisor, Ajit Doval, as an extraordinary servant of the state, that the state building on which the narrative depends and from which the narrative derives has had a big role by this Mr. Doval. And I'll tell you why I say so. I know Mr. Doval personally, so I declare that, and I have a great deal of esteem for him. But something else happened many years ago when I was talking to our renowned Lieutenant General Jacob, the liberator of Bangladesh. And he told me about an argument he had with Ajit Doval in the Northeast, where the army had captured, I think, that leading Manipur rebel. And Doval wanted him for the IB. And General Jacob said, I told him, no, he's my prisoner. And then Jacob added about Doval, the bravest civilian I have ever met. And Jacob was not a man to pay empty compliments. And of course, some of his reputation is now known, and that he's done extraordinary things, and he continues to do extraordinary things to institutionalize a state which has been emerging rapidly in the past decade. So that is the narrative. Now, what would an Indian narrative look like? Because narratives depend on two things, broadly speaking. Narrative. One is the divine and religion. In every culture, divine and religion is a basis of who you are and what you are becoming. And the other actually is warfare, your great victories. Now,
Before we go into what an Indian national myth building or narrative would look like, let's talk a little bit to put this in context about other countries who have gone through this process. Because then when we come to the India part, it will help people understand much better how this has been done in other parts of the world, and therefore, in context, what India has done. Some may be similar and maybe a lot uniquely. The examples that come to my mind, which of course a lot of people would be interested in, and something that I have looked at also, of course, is America. You know, the city upon the hill, and so on and so forth. And of course, what is being done by China today. And of course, you know, there are European examples, the British example, of course, as you were alluding to. Perhaps you could talk a little bit about all this.
Let me start with the American one, since you brought this up. America is a new country, and ultimately its sense of who they are really is based on Christianity, that we are a Christian nation and a revolutionary nation. That is a source of great pride, Christianity and revolution. Then you have another basically fabricated aspect of who they think they are, which is the frontier myth of a civilization mission which tamed the wild as it moved westward. But actually, this was a case of a nation being built on genocide and by slaves, southern slavery and genocide of the native population. So this frontier myth is something which Roosevelt, the early 20th century Secretary of State, said was a formative experience of his life, fighting American Indians. And the other issue is that Christianity also became very contentious in America by the 18th, 19th century, very contentious, and it split because the popular churches were very resistant to the authority exercised over them by the established church. They wanted their autonomy. This actually was definitely an aspect of assertion of selfhood and indigenous experience. The myriad churches, which have since become the fundamentalist churches, which are basically a business enterprise. The fundamentalist churches have got very little to do with Christianity, as that very distinguished Oxford scholar John Barton has demonstrated in his wonderful book, The History of the Bible. He's a priest himself, by the way. So that is the American experience. The more interesting one is a Chinese one. The Chinese also have a founding myth based on the divine, and it is remarkably the story of Brahma from which life begins for the Hindus. Very similar. But the Chinese are a very old civilization, and they were politically very savvy from the word go. Around 251 BC, the emperor destroyed all local records to make people forget who they were. And this process continued into the Han dynasty of creating one nation by creating a common history. And then you have two or three critical aspects of Chinese history. The first is, of course, the notion of mandate from heaven. The mandate from heaven actually is an ethical aspect of the legitimacy of rule. That hereditary rule, which is not virtuous, which can be ended. And it happened in the 11th century. I think the Shan were overthrown and a new set of rulers came to place because they were virtuous. And then we have the one which haunts China to this day and has a very big impact on how it behaves, is the mandate from heaven. Sorry, the bigger part, sorry. That was the divine one. The Middle Kingdom syndrome. The Middle Kingdom regards itself as a center of the universe, at the center of the hub of civilization, and the rest of the world are really the uncivilized people who can be kept at bay and at best become vassals of the Middle Kingdom. So this is China's myth. And you know, it never disappeared with communism. Mao often compared himself to emperors of the past. And of course, we should bear in mind the Gupta period of China, of enormous achievement, was the Tang dynasty. And all of these form a part of their memory, their collective memory, and a lot of this is celebrated in poetry, but they are also great record keepers, unlike us. Of course, in our case, so much was destroyed over a huge period of predation and invasion. So the Chinese have a very strong sense of the past, the only period where they lost a sense of who they were, and that, of course, became very important in their recovery, was during the Opium Wars and the occupation of China, in which I'm afraid the Indian merchants played a big role, including G.T. Birla and the Tagore family supplying opium in their ships. But the Chinese Opium Wars became a fundamental turning point for reviving a sense of their past, the Chinese Revolution, and then the Communist Revolution, always referred back to that. So that's China, which has a strong sense of the past, history, and myth. The myth, of course, always a popular expression of some historical events, which may not be perfectly recalled, but they did in fact occur. Then you have the German experience, which is quite an important one. The German sense of selfhood actually was initiated by Tacitus, the Roman historian Tacitus, in a publication called the Germania in 98 AD. Tacitus wrote this as a way of illustrating how corrupt his own Rome had become. And he wanted to portray the Germans as a pure, unspoiled people, including something which came to be very important later on, no intermarriage, purity of blood, etc., etc. Now, this also included in the German memory to this day the great victory of Arminius against the Roman legions, where they absolutely defeated them. And the culture of Nibelungenlied, celebrated also, of course, in Wagner. So German memory goes back 2,000 years of being exceptional people, of unpolluted blood, of Aryan blood, and of course this all collapses into catastrophe under the Nazis. But you know, the Nazis did not appear from nowhere. If you read 19th century German accounts of Slavic peoples, the seeds were always there. They always considered the Slavs subhuman. German humanities was very culpable, and Nazism built on that, and of course, took an extreme form. So that is memory, a memory which actually came out very badly in the end. Then you have said,
I want you to also refer to Russia. There is a reason that Vladimir Putin likes as his hero Peter the Great. And of course, many Russians look to the Empress Catherine and so on and so forth. There is a whole mythology of the greater Rus there too.
You see, Russian consciousness of the self, a country which has an enormously creative history of literature, poetry, music, and also some of the most extraordinarily brave people the world has ever known. But their memory is twofold. One is the Christianity which came to Russia, and it became a Christian nation, and their military victories. For a long time, the Russians were under the tutelage of the Mongols and the Turks. And in 1571, Moscow was burnt to the ground by Crimean Turkish hordes. 80,000 dead, 150,000 dead, 80,000 taken as slaves. But in 1591, the Russians prepared. They had a military revolution, a revolution in fort building, and they defeated the Turco-Mongols comprehensively. And this was a very important part of the memory of who the Russians were. And then, of course, Peter and Catherine completely overran the Turks, took control of Crimea. And Peter was, by the way, a very cruel but effective ruler. And Putin kind of sees himself in Peter's. But Peter built the great city of St. Petersburg. He modernized Russia. And this is what Russians look to as their heritage, the modernization of Russia to withstand attacks from the west and the east, the Polish-Lithuanian Empire and the Ottomans and the Mongols from the east. And Russia asserted itself by resisting these two great forces. And one must not forget, the Polish-Lithuanian Empire was a very powerful, long-lasting polity. Then, of course, they had their enormous victory over Napoleon. The British celebrate this as their victory in Waterloo with Wellington. Nothing could be further from the truth. One of my former colleagues at LSE, who's now a professor at Cambridge, who's actually Russian by origin, traces back the 1815 war, 1812 war actually for Russians, to his ancestors. And it was the Russians who defeated Napoleon. And it was Alexander, the Tsar, who marched on horseback into Paris. And the great, great General Kutuzov, who led that. And then, of course, we have Stalin's victory over the Nazis, which look back to this past of Kutuzov and all the other great victories, where extraordinary Russian courage and staying power defeated the Nazis within 30 miles of Moscow. That's when the tide was turned, and their great generals from Rokossovsky to so many others. I remembered and celebrated Russia. Russians have a very strong sense of the past. In every city has a war memorial. People go to these war memorials. That is why the Russian people are supporting Putin in Ukraine. They know that if Ukraine becomes part of NATO, German tanks will be on their border, a border which cannot be defended because it is so long. They will have to mobilize millions of men to police that entire border. So Russian memory is of their Christianity, and in fact in 1591 they carried the picture of Mary and the child to war, and they believed that this was why they won. And the clergy and the ordinary people all participated in preparation for the war, building forts. This is exactly what happened in Moscow, where women and children were helping to build the ramparts, the defenses of Moscow. So war has been a very important part of the formation of Russian memory. In the British case, they've forgotten the Norman invasion, where basically actually the mass of the Anglo-Saxon men was slaughtered and replaced by Norman nobles. Genetics actually shows that only the genes of the women survived. The genes of the men did not survive. So that actually indicates basically what happened to them. But why do they have that? And Ranger and Hobsbawm, in their wonderful book, Invention of Tradition, say the most important part of such tradition and memories are to do with social cohesion. And social cohesion for England, in their view, really started in the 18th century with the Enlightenment, the decline of the church and the decline of absolute monarchy, you see, was something had to be replaced. So the myth making began. The British actually did a smart thing. They traced their heritage back to Greece. They declared themselves the inheritors of the Greek heritage, which is completely foolish. And there's a wonderful book demonstrating how false this was. And then they have a celebratory monarchy, like you may recall, trooping of the colour, to give a sense of stability, continuity, to create loyalty of the people to their symbols and nationhood. It is all about creating and upholding the nation and for allowing authority to function. Without authority, there is chaos. And as Hobbes says, without order, there is no freedom. So this is what underpinned the notion of a stable British society, and it has been. Britain is in a lot of trouble now because the chickens are coming home to roost. The decline of Christianity, which is not simply about the worship of Jesus and his Gospels, it is about the culture of a society which is embedded in Shakespeare, Byron, and everything, Tennyson, Blake. All of that were unifying features, a grid which held. All of this has retreated in a form of secular reason. And secular reason tends to be instrumental, selfish, and short-term. And this is what is unraveling. And I'm afraid in England, it has become so weak that they are swallowing a huge dose of an upsurge of Islam. And the person who is supposed to become Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister's replacement, Rachel Rayner, is a very strong supporter of Islamism. It is being said she will end the inquiry effectively into Pakistani rape gangs. So Britain is in a lot of trouble. Its legal traditions militate against strong action, and membership of the European Court of Human Rights also militates. So they are really a lost people. People are voting for politicians who are not defending their interests. A bit like India, really. A bit like India, except for Modi winning 3 times. Now, so let us come back to India.
And let's come back to Dhurandhar.
No, but let me just quickly preface that. If we have to build an Indian narrative, you have to talk about the Gupta period. How many of us were taught about that in school? We have to talk about the greatness of that, not because we want to imitate that, but for that to imitate and inspire the future. Who will we talk about? In our Great War, Suheldev, Borphukan, 17th century, Rani Naiki Devi, 12th century, Bappa Rawal, who fended off the Arabs in the 8th century. All of this will come back, and that immediately militates against the secular view of India, because these are all going to say the Muslims were invaders, which they were. But once you revive them, so the left and the establishment has struggled to keep them out of purview, to make sure that this does not motivate. But you know, something bizarre has happened by an accident of technology. This reverie has been destroyed by the social media. I'm not deeply fond of the social media because there is so much nonsense on it, but the social media has facilitated an opening of the debate. Because those who are disempowered by the mainstream media now have found a voice. Even people like Meenakshi Jain, the historian and now Rajya Sabha member, couldn't get published. Sitaram Goel, Ram Swaroop, they're all available online now. You are available, though I know your books are also bought over the counter. Sanjeev, new breed of historians. Vikram Sampath. So, you know, this is partly a social media phenomenon as well, because you are not known just by people buying your books. You're known on the social media. So people are now crying out to be told who they are and what they are. But you know, Hindu civilization is peculiar in one way. We do not have a sense of the other. Every other civilization has flourished by creating another. The Chinese, the Germans for sure, the Russians, but we do not emotionally have an other. We want in the end to embrace everybody as being part of one family. And you know, this is not simply something we say. It is deeply rooted in our psyche. Whether it's good or bad, I leave to others. It has some good points, because indeed that is the only way people should live, that everybody is your family. But also it has bad points because we do not understand who our adversaries are. But this is because we do not have a religion in the traditional sense. We have a philosophical worldview, which is a worldview and not a Hindu view. It came from Hindu and the Indus Valley civilization, but it is a view which embraces the whole world, and anybody can adapt to this particular view of how we should live. So our narrative, unfortunately, will have to create an adversary, and Pakistan has presented itself as a very handy candidate. China, unfortunately, because of his Middle Kingdom syndrome, only accepts neighbors as vassals. Now, that will never be acceptable to India. And no matter which Indian government is in power, they will not accept this. India actually, I think, deep down is very anxious to have a profound and intimate cultural interaction with China, because we believe that the Confucianism, Buddhism, and Hinduism overlap in many, many ways. Confucian ethics and Hindu ethics overlap. Buddhism overlaps. And indeed, the Chinese emperor did want Buddhism to become the national religion. And the Buddhist monks said, no, we can't leave India. Japan's Buddhism went from Bengal. The original documents of Japanese Buddhism are in Bengali. If you go to Japan, you'll see them in their temples. So that whole region, Korea, Japan, India, have much in common. But the fly in the ointment is China's view of itself. If that could be mitigated, I do believe it would be a force for good in the region and for the wider world. And India certainly, for whatever reason, has no territorial ambitions. It wants to protect what it has. And many good things could happen. But, we need a narrative on Dhurandhar, which I believe the first
Going
one.
back to Dhurandhar, yes.
Dhurandhar, the first one which I saw, I didn't like it as it started. It's a bit slow and a bit strange the way it started with that beating of the Indian spy, and I couldn't understand where it was going. But then it surely picked up, and then it conquered everything with the overall narrative. The overall narrative is something refreshing to see. We have a sense. And people say it's mythology. It is not. It is fictionalized but based on historical fact.
That's right.
And I understand part 2 is even more so. I only wish our distinguished producer, director, and scriptwriter Aditya Dhar had employed RVS Mani, the former Home Ministry official who was in the ministry building during 26/11, to act as a consultant. He would have had some very specific pointers if that were the case. But surely we have to be deeply grateful to him and for all the people who acted in that, for presenting us something which is extraordinary. I don't know if you heard about this strange story. Prime Minister Carney, and I don't remember.
His
in Hyde Park having a jog.
His Instagram really exploding.
He had a jog. Was it with the Australian Prime Minister or New Zealand?
Yes, I think Australian.
And they were talking about Dhurandhar. And I think the Australian said, I've seen it. Can you imagine 2 prime ministers of 2 countries far away going for a jog in Hyde Park talking about Dhurandhar? Now that in a way symbolizes what the film has done. I hope now the Indian state will pay attention to seizing the narrative. The Indian state in the last decade has done so much that we can barely complain. It has achieved so much, but I think they need to pay much more attention to institutional narrative building. Narrative building cannot happen in the popular mind alone. Institutions have to take the lead, and in every case of all the ones I've described, the narrative and the mythology and the history were constructed by purposive state action, and it must start with school and university curriculums. This is where the whole story, otherwise people will still think that Tipu Sultan was a great hero. We made a start. I think 3 years ago, we did something spectacular which people didn't notice. We built a very fundamental part of our narrative, that is Mr. Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister, did. by putting up Subhash Bose's statue. This was a powerful message of who we are, that we are a militant nation. We are a war-fighting nation. And this was a huge symbol, quietly but decisively erected in Delhi. He could have put Mahatma Gandhi there. He didn't. In fact, he repudiated that part of our history of peace at all costs, peace better than even death. So we have to plead with our state. It is not rocket science. There are a lot of very good scholars in India who can make a start. You among them and all the others. It will not take more than a year or two to revise the school history, sociology and politics curriculum. I would say economics as well. The university one, I have a wonderful model which costs very little, which I've shared with people in government. We must make a start. We must build on this, because otherwise we will never unite the country. Otherwise Dravidianism, Khalistani sentiment, communism, Marathi Manus, which is now Islamic Marathi Manus, and all these frivolous diversions will continue to haunt us, and caste, which has been used against us as our auto da fe, will dominate our consciousness. I will only add, everyone who is working on caste, whether it is in Oxford, working on Phule, I think I know, you know who I mean, or anybody else, they are basically calling for the destruction of the repositories of India's knowledge heritage. Because these are the people, for better for worse, who became the repositories of India's knowledge. And they're calling for their destruction. And this is how the church has operated for 2,000 years. From Augustine and beyond. Destroy the existing culture and civilization. And it is now a political project. Islam at least has no pretense. Islam is both a religion and a political ideology. And it has kept people together. Islam by remaining and controlling the narrative. Islamic narrative is not controlled by anybody. It is controlled by the mosque and the madrasa. And it is potent. Everybody who goes to the mosque and madrasa comes back with a common view of the world and their place in it. Indians don't have that. And we need to do that. It does not have to be exclusivist, because we are fundamentally not exclusivist, but we have to have a sense of the real world. And Rabindranath Tagore, in a wonderful essay celebrated by none other than Sir Isaiah Berlin, argued that nationalism is an unfortunate necessity in a world of predators. I was shocked to hear that great poet say something so very astute.
Leave it at that, Dr. Sen. That's been a fascinating conversation. As always, every conversation with you is a tour de force of absolutely educative and fascinating. Thanks very much for talking to me on why Dhurandhar represents a turning point in India's narrative building, in its national myth making, putting it all in context for us. Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you.